When I first learned about disciple-making movements, it struck a little bit of fear in me. And the reason is that I knew that in order to follow that path, it was going to require change. There's an amazing story in Luke chapter 7 where Jesus is affirming the ministry of John the Baptist. And as he's affirming the ministry of John the Baptist, Scripture makes this incredible statement about the religious leaders of Jesus' day. It says in verse 30, it says, the Pharisees and the lawyers, they rejected the purpose of God for themselves, not having been baptized by John. Ow, I just think, man, the religious leaders of Jesus' day missed what God was doing in their generation because they refused to change. They refused to see that God was doing something different. It reminds me of another story that I just read earlier this week. In 1 Samuel chapter 15, we read the story of God rejecting Saul as king. And the story has always kind of set a little weird with me. I haven't known what to do with it. But as I was reading it today, or just here a couple days ago, I realized that it's this issue of am I or are we completely surrendered to God and to His purposes? Or are we simply trying to do what we think God might want us to do and then offering Him what we feel like is maybe our best? And so in the story, Samuel, God's prophet, God speaks through Samuel and challenges Saul to utterly destroy the Amalekites, to give over destruction every person and every animal, which again makes me a little squeamish, but in that day, that was God's will for King Saul. And so Saul goes and fights the battle. He has an amazing victory, and yet he chooses not to follow through on everything that God asked him to do. And so after the battle is over, Samuel catches up with Saul, and he confronts him. He says, why didn't you obey the voice of the Lord? And Saul's like, I did. And Samuel says, well, what's this bleating of sheep and this lowing of oxen that I hear in my ears then? You see, Saul he had taken a lot of the spoil, the best of the sheep and the lambs and the oxen and the different animals, and had kept back the best for himself and for the people. The voice of the people had persuaded him not to follow through on what God had said for him to do. And so Saul at first tries to defend himself, and then Samuel challenges him and makes this very, very pointed statement in verses 22 and 23. He says, has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of divination, and presumption is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, He has also rejected you from being king. The religious leaders of Jesus' day missed God's purpose for their lives. Saul missed God's purpose for his life. It challenges me to make me think about, Lord, am I completely surrendered to you? Am I completely open to what you might be doing in this generation? So much so that if you were doing something different than what I think you want, I'd be open to that. I'd be willing to do that. So today my challenge, whoever you are, wherever you're at listening to this, is am I completely surrendered to the Lord? Are we willing to obey? Or are we simply wanting to sacrifice to bring Him what we think He might want or what we're comfortable bringing Him? I can bring Him what I think He might want, but ultimately it's what He wants and what He's doing in this generation that matters and counts. And He's looking for a people who are yielded to Him, who are surrendered to Him, willing to obey all that He says, even if it makes us uncomfortable. So that's my prayer today, is that we would be more like King David, who steps onto the scene right after 1 Samuel 15, 1 Samuel 16, is anointed king, and proves to be a man who is everything that Saul was not. He was willing to do all that God asked. He was willing to be repentant, to own that he was wrong. Whereas Saul, it seems, was more set on building his kingdom and his dynasty, having the fame of his name more well known than God's. My prayer is today that we would be more like King David rather than a King Saul. That we would be more like Jesus than the religious leaders of his day. And I hope that's your prayer too. Thanks for listening.